Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today is a bit of an unusual program. I had originally intended to have a conversation with my guest, Dr. Bruce Deamer, about the destiny of life and consciousness, focusing in on his work with NASA to develop computer simulations of space missions. He has even designed spacecraft for the purpose of harvesting asteroids. He is a polymath. You may remember our previous interview in which we discussed his many interests, including the origins of life itself. He developed this theory with my old friend, Professor David Deamer at the University of California at Santa Cruz. It was featured on the cover of Scientific American a few years ago. He is also one of the pioneers in the field of virtual reality and is the author of the book Avatar. He maintains a museum of ancient, now one might even call them antique, but they're not that old, but the history of computer technology. He also maintains the archives for counterculture figures like Timothy Leary and Terence McKenna. Truly an amazing individual, but I was very surprised because when we began our discussion, Bruce informed me that something else was on his mind, and the conversation turned to the subjects of universal love and a concept known to the Buddhists as Dharmakaya. So I'm going to switch over now to the internet video, and you'll see for yourself how this amazing conversation, truly one of the most interesting that I've ever had, let's see how it unfolds. So we'll talk today about space exploration and see where that leads us.
Well, I'm in a slightly different mood.
Oh, all right.
I'm in a more soft, flowy, mystical mood than a hardcore techie mood.
Oh, okay.
This Sunday, I went through a major personal experience, which was sometimes called Dharmakaya in the Bon Buddhist tradition, and it's caused a whole opening of my system. And this was part of the Luminous program that I've been in for 4 years. It's a healing arts awakening school.
No, you haven't talked to me about that yet. I didn't know you were involved in such a program.
Yeah, it's more and more what I'm talking about these days, and it's science and non-duality. I'm going to introduce. They've invited the primary teachers from Luminous, and I'm going to introduce them to the community in October. And it's a whole other side of me that I started to talk about it on Chris Ryan's podcast about a year ago. And it's the parts where sometimes you probably know all this stuff: internal family systems, the practices around wounds, inner wounds that we get when we're very young. Yeah. And it to my thinking, for some new kinds of thinking, it's really the boot up operating system of humans. And our entire world is shaped by the conditioning of these inner parts, these little children running around. And so I've been on this path for a couple of decades through my own healing, actually since the 80s, because I was adopted. I was given up at birth, and it left a strong imprint.
Sure.
That started out as, and we can probably even start the show around my origins and trying to heal that hard knot of an imprint.
Well, let's just keep going, and we'll take it from here.
You could sort of even open it with a question. We've heard about a lot about your science and your technical, your mental space. What about the real Bruce?
Yeah.
Where did Bruce come from?
Sure. I mean, we did this whole introductory lecture about your professional interests and which are enormous, but we didn't really touch at all on the personal side, except to say that you had used entheogens, and so I'm just honored that you're willing to talk about these other things with me now, Bruce.
Yeah, thank you, Jeff. I'm in a kind of soft mood this week because a soft state because of the beautiful spring rains, but also because of an experience that I had on Sunday with what's called our Luminous Awareness Institute group, which is a really advanced healing and awakening school that's been doing its work for about 12 years, and I joined 4 years ago. And we just finished a 2-year program. And the experience was, if you can think that in all the history of the healing arts, often there's been a teacher there, or a guide, or a mentor, or even to some degree like icons and spirit animals and things like that. There's been an other. And why should we care about healing? Why should we care about the little wounds that are inside of us? Because those wounds pattern and they create a system. Now here I am back in techie talk. But they create a little internal society. I sometimes call it the inner kindergarten inside each of us. And these beings, if you will, run around and they fashion what some would call the personality or our responses to the world. And to a large extent, the structure that emerges is not us. And all through the ages, the great sages and teachers and even the jokesters have commented that none of this is you. What you are is, the Atman meets Brahman in one tradition. Or you are a droplet in the sea of consciousness. You are a piece of God, or in fact, you may be just an instantiation of what some might call God, or super energy, or super mind, instantiated in a body, in a form, patterned by experiences from our lineage and from our youth and our shaping and our environment. And you're just this beautiful instantiation or piece of art in the world, like a sculpture or a painting or a song. And you come into this world and you play a role, the Shakespeare saying we strut on the stage only briefly, something like that. But all of that, you are a droplet from sort of the cosmic miracle. And that's what I experienced on Sunday. And I've been there before in different ways, but this was special. This was something they sometimes refer to as Dharmakaya, and in the Bon tradition.
The Bon being the Tibetan tradition, the pre-Buddhist Tibetan shamanistic tradition. So the school that you're involved in would you say it's aligned with that tradition?
Well, our main teacher and the founder of Luminous discovered a Dan Brown translation of some of the earliest Bon texts and presented at our last gathering that, in fact, this particular text, which is 1,300 years old, represents what we are doing in our group. And she was both surprised and maybe slightly miffed in a funny way that we didn't come up with it. That this is actually precisely what was laid out in this text, and in that teaching, it's what in the modern healing arts you would call self-to-self work. So instead of the teacher and the student being here, or the practice even being here and the student being here, and the practice being a stand-in for a teacher or a guru or something like that, it actually is a complete union of the self with the very thing that you're discovering, which is that the self is all, and that there's a totality of energy that is boundless and has infinite capacity to self-organize and heal. And you just really have to open your system and ask for its help. And it's flowing everywhere. It's the miracle of this sort of synchronous field. It's the universal, in a sense, something like universal love that people open to now and then. But I experienced that coming in of that energy system, working my healing in a rapid fire way. And every time that my consciousness would go down into the substructure of me that the energy was moving through, and I would point out to the energy that was coming through where to heal, I would see it sort of sinuously moving. One of our trainings and the teaching in this bond tradition is you're then now binding to the structure, you're attaching, and you're actually getting in the way of the healing. So the instruction is, the pointing out is, go to what's called a spatial, open-hearted in a sense, or just even a complete awakened awareness, where you empty. I'm doing it a little bit right now. Mm-hmm. You empty of form, you empty of emotion and structure, and then the energy, and I could feel it, it's really roaring now. And the energy comes through, and the energy starts to work when you detach and become an open space for it. And I left that session, which was just a 10 or 15 minute session, realizing that I felt held by this energy, that I had a relationship for the first time to this force in the universe that everyone talks about, that I had a personal relationship. I could feel it as a being. And I think in Christian traditions they call it feeling saved or reborn. In other traditions there are different words for it. But I felt for the first time I wasn't an isolated, bobbing little being in a great ocean of separation, that there was something else was buoying me up, that was literally holding me. And as I walked across the Ananda Retreat Center where we do our work, it was rolling, continuously rolling through the system. It was like in ayahuasca traditions, you can feel this healing power. But this was completely, it wasn't a plant medicine, it was a human medicine. It was something else. It was not from any exogenous source. Maybe it is all exogenous, but maybe it's all one anyway. But it was so powerful, Jeff. And I'm still, the one thing on the way out, because I know myself well, you know thyself, they say, is that I knew that when you have a healing like this, when something is so potent, it heals so many of the internal wounds, it resolves so many things so quickly, you get a burst of energy, you get a burst of capability. So of course when I get back from there, I'm just working and doing project after project. I mean, I'm super productive, and I know that when I do that, when that comes in, I can drown that healing, because often these healings need a slow wave. They need sitting, they need contemplation, they need being with, to set, to integrate. Because of course what I do is I can do anything now, you know, and I take on all these tasks and whatnot. So I knew that this was my predilection. And so I asked the field itself, the energy or whatever system it was, to please stay with me and remind me that this is going on, and you were still there. Tug on my little string now and then and be present and help me to not forget. Help me to let this land. And truthfully, it's been there all week. And our recording 2 days ago was so clear and so smooth because of that healing and because that energy is still flowing. And I just wanted to share that with the viewers, that this is something I'm undergoing at the moment.
Well, I can feel it. It's quite tangible to me, just being with you and not just listening with my ears, but listening with my heart. It's very obvious. What surprises me is that I didn't pick up on it on Wednesday. Today is Friday, when we spoke, and you had this initial experience on Sunday. So it's really been with you now for nearly a week, which I think is quite significant.
Sometimes in our lives, we encounter something so powerful and profoundly good from the universe. And if we say, we don't know what we're doing. We can't navigate this thing. We can't sit on our pillow and do our morning practices alone and figure this out. And we just give up. We say, please help this little being. Some part of us may say, well, you're not good enough to ask for help. Or another wounded part might say, you can't, you'll never feel it. There's all these different processes that might block that. But when you give up on all that, and I think this is what happened to a lot of people through history, they just gave up on striving, on efforting. And they became a complete collapsed system in some way. And they just, and it's hard to say this, but some of the most beautifully liberated people that I've ever met are those that have just received a really bad diagnosis of a disease or a cancer, because at some point, and this happened to my biological father, literally close to his death, about 8-9 years ago, I had a call with him, and he was in the hospital, and it's actually the last time I heard his voice, and he said, "The pain is gone, the pain is gone, I can't believe it, the pain is gone." And it had left him. I had no idea of the trauma, the wound that this man had been carrying all his life. I mean, he drank a lot. He was hard to reach. All these things. There was a beautiful being in there, and there was a huge shell of damage there. But he was liberated in that moment, and he was in a hospital bed, and his organs were failing, and all that left, and he felt for the first time the lack of his pain had been removed. And it's a shame, to have that release or that freedom come so late in life, after so much suffering.
It sounds like what you're saying is you feel some pain lifting yourself right now.
There's a flow that is going, and in that flow is a super intelligence. There's the irony of me and my work, and you can kind of get at it now in the comments that we've gotten from those wonderful listeners is, yes, I'm a hardcore materialist. I'm a reductionist. But I'm an experientialist. I'm still, in a sense, how to say this? I mean, I sound like a mystic far on the other scale of what you might call the woo meter. And because in a sense, we can't pin ourselves down to mechanistic approaches. However, I would offer that this intelligent energy that we can feel and we can use on a daily basis to work with human systems. I don't think I can move a coin, 1 centimeter with my mind, but with human systems, human to human interaction, very powerful and almost Jedi-like or sci-fi-like things happen continuously. Just in human interactions alone, just the synchronous energies of our friend Nick arriving and showing me how to make a hardwood floor out of plywood, so we don't have to spend a month putting in oak floors. And like him arriving at the precise moment when this concept can come in, it's like the synchronous field or the intelligence guiding me forward at the exact moment. And this thing is powerful. And let me relate a story of how powerful this thing is for a Walking Dead reductionist materialist like me, doing demos. But I'm still I'm an explanationist. I'm wanting to find explanations. So are you ready for this?
Yeah.
So this is an example of how what I've experienced walking through life for 45, 50 years since I was about 10. So when I was about 10 or 11, I thought, okay, if I walk out of the house and I have to give a thing that I borrowed back to another boy, and I walk out of the house and I'm nervous about it, like I'm thinking, he could be mad at me if I can't find him and give it back to him. What if he's already mad at me? What if I should be afraid to walk out of the house because I've had this thing of his for too long? And I'm worried, and I walk down the street. I never find the boy, and I'm just worried the whole time. And kind of, I noticed that my field, my consciousness, and everything around me seemed to be shaky. Birds weren't even coordinated. They were colliding and, kind of things like that. And so then I would go back to the house and say, okay, we're going to shift modes, because I can sense that there's a thing outside of me. There's a thing that can guide me. I've always sort of felt it, but I'm old enough that I'm going to test it. So I'd walk out of the house in a different state. Like, I am listening. I am listening for signs. I walk along the street and suddenly it turns my body and makes me go down the alley. And then I'm going on this whole magical mystery tour. Now I'm at the slough. Now I'm sitting down and doing X. And I've still got this thing I need to give back to this boy. And I'm on an adventure, and I'm being moved around by intuition or by a force. I'm appreciating all of it. And then suddenly in the distance on the schoolyard across, I see the boy. And I wave. I mean, like I said to the synchronous field or whatever it is, just operate me, because I don't want my concern about this boy to come through, because I knew that even at that point that dogs could detect fear in a person. So there was something going on that was extra sensory, that was like some kind of communication grid, because dogs could detect when you're afraid of them. Every kid knows that, right? And so I went back to a different state, and I put my hand up so it would cast a brightness to the boy. That was what I was supposed to do. The feel like moving me, and then he came over, or we came right up to each other, and I lifted up and I had the thing to give to him, and he had this great grin. It's like, it's so good to meet you today. I was just thinking of you, and et cetera, et cetera. And oh, thanks for the object. You want it, you can keep it, because I have another one. And I had it wrong, right? I had it wrong that he needed it back. And, is it like a pocket watch that I borrowed or something like that? And anyway, we just went on a walk and became such good friends. I mean, it was, so I would do this over and over, and I became trusting in this field. I said, this is more intelligent than my little 11-year-old brain. It's a big system, and if I trust in it, it's always going to guide me. And it has all this time. And I was just doing A-B comparisons and decide which system to rely on, which OS to run for my lifetime. So in a sense, is that woo? I don't know. It certainly works if it's woo.
Well, it strikes me that what you've managed to do is to kind of run two operating systems simultaneously, so that you can shift gears when it becomes necessary to be a materialist, which, you're in biomedical engineering, and materialism works very well for that. But when you're dealing with other deeper issues, self-exploration, exploring, the inner cosmos, looking at what the Buddha was trying to point out to people and what the early shamanistic traditions are trying to tell us. Well, materialism has its limits when it comes to that. And so you shift gears. That seems like a very wise approach.
And Jeff, I also merge them completely.
Mm-hmm.
So in the quest to solve the riddle of the origin of life, that was done in an intuitive, field-connected way. Einstein called him his Gedanken experiment, when he would just let himself be taken over by the dream or the vision. So he was very mystical and trippy. And so from age 14, I was applying my scientific interests. I was merging them with one system, one tool set. And I call it being on the liminal ridge, kind of like right in here. If you can dance on this little ridge between, in a sense, the material, or some people would call it the mundane. I think that's kind of, things aren't really mundane at any level, and the magical or the mystical. And you're on that liminal ridge between them, perfectly balanced between them, so that one movement in one can shift you toward the other, and then you are in this exquisite magic state. And then you shift back and you take some of that magic to the material, and you test it out in the material, and then you take the material back to the magic and say, let's work on this. And that's what I've done now for 20 years, really consistently. So how did life begin? That was a dance on that liminal ridge of taking molecular models and combinatorial models into magic space and asking if this works. Is this the way we were made? And then taking the insights back and testing them out in this world. And so, in a sense, it's one practice,
And you've been able to apply that same balancing act, really, to simultaneously explore 4 or 5 different disciplines, which is really an enormous accomplishment. I can imagine that at some level, at the peak performance that you've shown now for decades, that these issues dating back to your childhood are going to also want to come up and be addressed.
Yeah, and this sort of brings us to a big topic for me, which is why I went on various healing paths in the 80s, a kind of encounter group. We've all been through this. We're old enough that we remember encounter groups and emotional release. And then in the 90s, different practices, and then entheogenic practices, and then shamanic practices, and now the luminous practice. Because by the middle 80s, I'd say, I realized that if I looked down, if I wasn't so mental, I started feeling my insides. There was a hard knot, really hard, painful knot, really deep down at my core that I found. And I had built a hard shell over myself where I couldn't really feel emotion. So the encounter groups helped. I hadn't cried in 10 years. I was a doer, not a beer, really. I was a very good doer because I was writing code. When you're writing code, you're in a flow that really doesn't have much emotion unless there's a bug you can't find or something. This frustration you can blow up suddenly because you get yourself so exhausted when you're writing enormous code sets, which is what I was doing. This hard knot inside of me was, I realized I had to look at it. It was something that was blocking flow. It was something that didn't feel good. And I was concerned about it. And that was the beginning. And that was maybe when I was 23, 24, that kind of thing. And it turns out that after all these years, it was really the unborn embryo of me. Mm-hmm. And one night I was able to birth that embryo. And really the flow then began. And the embryo was unborn for one very clear reason, that when I was in utero, my parents, my biological parents, decided they had to give me up because they were just too poor. My biological father had been basically worked on the British Columbia ferries and been a captain, whatnot, or he's actually going to become a sea captain later. Was poor. He'd lost his job at a filling station, and this was hard times. This is 1961. There was no birth control. There was really no women's rights. It was a fairly tough society, really, right out of the 50s. So he lost his job, and they were just impoverished. Both of them were trying to live on their own in Victoria, British Columbia. And I had to be given up. And I felt that. My being, whatever it was, I think it was about 4 months, maybe 5 months in term, that I felt the love connection that had been there as an embryo in the womb feels with, it's a cradling, that the connection was dropped. And I really feel that it was dropped very clearly, because when I later met my biological parents and I met my biological mother, she had the capacity to drop connections pretty easily. I think her trauma was extremely severe. Her dissociative disorder that actually she has, the triggerable dissociative disorder, very, very clear on the surface. So when I was no longer to be, I was dropped. And the embryo felt it. So that when I came out, part of me knew I was coming out alone. So I built a capsule around myself. And I've been through now several angles or points of view of experiencing my birth, my conception, the growth, and my birth, and then into infancy. When my biological parents came and picked me up, my mother looked in my eyes, and her comment was, years later, "You were in your own world. You were in your own world." So I was this being that was already deeply internally connecting, because that's where I resourced, but I was not making eye contact. I'm sure that eventually I did, but I would have been called, I would have been on the spectrum, or autistic or Asperger's child, but there was no such classification in those years. And I was deeply internal, but my consciousness deeply wandered in the world. And I think that it started to wander because it was searching for the love that dropped. So I was, in a sense, realming, as we call it in Luminous. I was realming to look for that love that left. And that became in a sense, a kind of skill or superpower, that my consciousness can realm very widely throughout the solar system and into time, into small space. It can do a lot of, it can entertain the little being, it can carry the being. Now, in this whole process, the healing of that hard knot was I had to rebirth myself, and I had to do it multiple times, using multiple tools, until that self was birthed in love and in connection. I had to raise that self again. And this was quite a process, so that I could come into union with a self that was now remade, and then that knot dissolved, or is no longer there. Yeah.
I have the impression that at an instinctive age you realized that you had lost your parents, and you've spent much of your life sort of rediscovering yourself as a child of the universe.
Yeah, I'd say that's pretty accurate. There's another incredible experience that came back to me very vividly about 15 years ago, which was the turning on of my vision. So in the stages of the making of this being called Bruce, there was a stage when I was in the adoption ward for about 12 days. And that stage was very, very critical to my development. normally in that period, the parents and the mother is holding the baby and resourcing the baby, and there's the smells and the voice and the reassurance. It's incredibly important at that time. Stan Grof talks a lot about this critical postnatal, neonatal period. And I was wrapped up in an adoption ward with probably 100 other crying babies. For some reason, the sound of pouring water is extremely upsetting to me. And I think that it went back to that sound of water being poured was happening then. And it was one of the only sort of identifiable sounds in the room, but it wasn't identified with a kind of a caring thing. It was just sort of a sound, and it probably ties into a deep thing. But that what happened to me when I was sort of pulling out this deep memory as I saw these bars, I saw these black and white shapes in the state that I was in this reconstructing state. And then suddenly they resolved into a three-dimensional mesh like that. And my consciousness started turning. And it was basically the crib. It was the actual crib, and it was my 3D vision turning on. Because little babies, they don't have color vision coming right away, and they don't have three-dimensional depth vision. That's why people hang those things that a little child can sort of try to look at first and reach, and they establish depth and color perception. But it turned on, it was vivid. And when that happened, when the 3D renderer turned on, my consciousness actually spiraled in this dream, if you could call it that, spiraled out of the crib through the top of the hospital. You could see the whole hospital down below and out to the limb of the earth. There was this glowing limb of the earth where my consciousness said, that is where I am. This is where I've come into. And then it came back down into the being. It checked it out. Now, I don't know if it was such a powerful sort of reconstruction that came back de novo. I don't know if that's what happens or if that's simply a metaphor. But it was another stage in my coming into this universe as we are all childs of the universe. It was one of the first moments.
Well, it sounds, as you describe it, it feels like an authentic memory that bubbled up.
It really does. There was one that happened just after that shaped me. So this turning on a vision occurred, and then I was at a funny kind of an angle. And, infants can't even turn over, or they can't turn themselves over. But somehow, suddenly in front of me was something that I called the black-eyed baby. And it was another baby. I didn't know it was. So in this particular state, it was suddenly just a face with black eyes that were looking at me, and it was the most terrifying thing I ever seen. And it was the first being that I had encountered. And I realized this is the first entity that I encountered. So in the world that I was in, there was no other beings. It was just me. I had been in the womb, and now I was in this very uncertain place that made no sense. And I wasn't particularly, or maybe I wasn't connecting with the nurses that were just picking up the babies and turning them and giving great care to the babies, because they knew what the babies were going through. And so care and love was happening, and babies were being fed, but they're being fed, from bottles and things like this. But this first being that I saw was another baby. And the other baby, for me, it felt like an attack. It felt like the most frightening thing I had ever seen was these black eyes, these piercing eyes, searching. And it caused me to collapse and go inward, because I had no idea what it was and what to do about it. Because I had no referent. There's no language. There's no nothing. It was just a recoiling and a panic. And it led me to be very non-visual, not making eye contact very easily at all. And it was the source of my tendency on the spectrum that it took quite a while it took another intense experience to be able to make eye contact comfortably with people at all. But so the recovery of where it started was this. And as I came to the realization of this is why I can't make eye contact, I realized that little baby was as uncertain and probably seeing me had the same response. What is going on? And I had empathy for the baby, and it melted that whole system. And because you can repattern your past effectively. And that was a huge insight and release from, and a knowing. If you have an understanding, this is where my reductionism comes in and my materialism. If you have a deep understanding of the events that patterned you, a knowing, a real knowing, they can reorganize quickly. If they remain a mystery, sort of shrouded and buried under layers of protectors and managers and coping mechanisms, they're not in their purity, because there's all this structure that builds around a personality to protect you from deep traumas and experience that is uncovered by numerous practices. But when you have the knowing, the wisdom or the knowing of how and why, you can really make a move.
Well, that may be reductionistic, but you're reducing down to knowing, down to a mental event. And I totally agree with you on that bringing these things into the light of consciousness can be very powerful, and it's very rare that a person can go that deep within themselves to recover an event that took place when you were just a few days old.
Yeah, and is it a metaphor? Is it real? But in a sense, then I go back to what happened on Sunday. It was an intelligent field giving me just what I needed to reduce my suffering. So if there was anything, so what a loving and caring thing. So was it real? Was it what really happened? It may not have been. It may not be, because the event is in the past. It's actually not recoverable. The past doesn't exist anymore. But the patterning given was precisely the patterning to unravel the condition and reduce my suffering. So regardless of whether it was true to what happened, back then.
I often tell people, based on personal experiences of my own, very different from yours, but they were instrumental in my becoming the person I am now. And what I often say to people is that when you strive to become the best version of yourself, the whole universe will reach out to help you. Yeah,
I think there's a saying, is it, when you have a closely held dream, you probably know this one, when you hold a dream so closely and dearly, then the whole universe lines up to make it come to be, or something like that. That people have it on their walls in their kitchen.
I'm not familiar with that saying, but it is very much in alignment with what I'm saying to you. And, another thing struck me, and that is your life is almost like a super person, because you're accomplished in so many different areas, major areas, not just little areas, but big areas, and several of them simultaneously. It's like a super heroic life that you've lived. And in thinking about superheroes, I realize many of them, Superman and Batman and many of the other classical superheroes that we've grown up with, were orphans.
And that is interesting. Yeah. That is really, really interesting. And these days I'm meeting more and more adoptees as I tell this story, and I hear their experiences of being capsules in the universe on their own. And they're special. In some ways it can be a hard road. It's a hard road because in effect, I saw the other side. I went through the other side because I met my biological parents and family, my full-blood brothers and sisters, back in my late 20s into my 30s. And I went into the womb of the family. I returned to that and could feel what it was like to be with my bio sister. And I know her and I love her to this day, and my biological brother. And I had a second sister who passed away of a brain tumor that I knew for 2 years. When I'm with them, I feel different. I'm a different human being. And it happens in an instant. And it's the nature and nurture thing. And so I can feel what it would have been like to be in the family, but I didn't go through the trauma of the conditions of the family. At that time, I was spared it, and they all say, you were the lucky one. Yeah. You were really lucky.
That's quite interesting. Your story reminds me a little bit of Evan Alexander. I think you may know him, and about his past life journey. He was also an orphan, and he believed that while he was in a deep coma state, not akin to a near-death state, he was in a very deep coma, and in that state he visited a heavenly-like realm and met a being who was a guide that he got to know rather well, because it seemed like weeks, and when he came out and met again his biological parents, he discovered the picture of a sister, a biological sister of his who had died, that he felt sort of an instantaneous closeness with while he was in a coma state.
Wow. And he met them after the coma. He hadn't met them
Well,
before.
she was already deceased. He only saw her picture, but he felt like he had encountered her in this out-of-body state. Well, it brings up an interesting question about life after death, which is really the most difficult problem of all for a materialist.
Yeah, and in some ways, so you're right. I mean, I compartmentalize, but I see it as a gradient. Like way over here in materialism and everything, we're really good, and we actually have to be good, or trains fall off train tracks, things like that.
That's right.
And then we go, and then we have a spectrum that we go along, and we go along, and we go along, and we're crossing into this realms that are bigger than human consciousness, bigger than human mentation and science and engineering, and they're huge spaces. And our dear friend Nick Herbert described this beautifully when his consciousness was opened in the 60s, realizing that consciousness is so much larger than the enterprise of science, for example. But what Nick did is he came back from that incredibly expanded view and union with something so enormous for a kid from Ohio, from an all-American town in Ohio, to experience that and then came back down and did decades of beautiful science. But he held that state no matter anyway, and he held that dialogue, and he sort of calls it quantum tantra. I think that is his name for it.
Yeah.
He held that conversation, but he's still going to want to have a physicist's explanation for certain problems. So it's in a way, if you can hold both and you can go back and forth, you can be quite grounded. If you only live in the magic and spirit realm, unless you're very skilled or like a shaman or shamaness, you can get really off center quickly, especially in the worlds of suburban, consumer society. If you stay in the world of the hardcore materialist reductionist, it's all just, you can become quite pessimistic and quite, it's a diet that's fairly, it's like thin gruel actually, in a way. And in science, there are people whose very lifeblood is drained out by the vicissitudes of the difficulty of the work. The laboratory bench work is difficult, just the grind of this thing, and it's all just nuts and bolts, and it just drains people. And they find not only solace, but insight and regeneration by going into the other magisteria that has been called over time. But you can use that magisteria to help your science, and you can use the science to teach the magisteria. So one of the things I've done in my life is I've realized that great big intelligence, if you will, is quite amorphous. And sometimes it needs focus. And so I have the wonderful tool of a focusing attention And I can focus my attention into that field or to that field and say, we need more of your focused attention, please. Pay attention and come up with more synchronous events, please, because our species is accelerating and you have to accelerate too. We just need more of you, whoever you are, big thing. Mm-hmm. And sometimes when I'm in that space, I do teachings of that big thing. I say, This is how we are. This is how we are made. This is how we operate. Pay attention. Watch this demonstration of how humans have organized their world so that you can know us better. Because I figure, you know what, if it's a great big amorphous field, does it have a proper bookkeeping system? No. It's a thing of its own that is made up of all of us and maybe all of the living world, but it can be fashioned into much more of a consciousness that we can relate to and that we can become in partnership with. And I can give you one example of, if you'd like, another story.
Yeah, sure.
So this was about 2 years ago. I was up on Skyline Drive up here near, it's the ridge, it's the liminal ridge between the magic of the Pacific Ocean and its glow off the San Francisco, Santa Cruz Mountains. And that's the magical, that light is so powerful. That was the light that shone through Big Sur on Esalen, for example. It's an incredible glow, and you see the marine layer and the trees. And then you're on this ridge called Skyline Drive, and you look down, it's the total materialist world of Stanford University and NASA Ames and Google and Facebook and Apple and in a grid, right? So that Skyline area is the liminal ridge between these worlds. So I go there a lot, and that's one of the reasons I moved here to Boulder Creek, is to be able to go up to this magical place. So I'm up there to do a hike, and I'm feeling particularly good. I leave my bloody phone in the car so that I'm not distracted, so I can be present. And I walk up the heights of Skyline Ridge, and I get to the point where I said, okay, now's the time. I'm going to turn and face the synchronous field. And I'm going to say to the field, thank you for all your guidance over these years since I was so little. Thank you for helping me to go on my path, because I also know it's your path, because you are working for our benefit so that we may survive, so that we may get through our challenges, because we are such miracles in the cosmos. We're precious, like church lady special. We're, whatever. We're remarkable. We're a remarkable creation. And so we have this remarkable attention that maybe is all from all of us. So I said, I'm dropping my veil. I'm dropping the veil to you. I see you. I see you. And I was looking out into the glowing woods and say, I know you're there. I know what you're doing, and I will follow. I'm your faithful follower. I'm your faithful soldier in this march of life or something. And suddenly, in my third eye, opened this field, basically a glowing square pattern. It was shimmering, very, very potent. And basically we beheld each other through this. I see you. I recognize you. And I just basically wanted to do that. Let's just drop it now and let's directly contact each other. And then it blinked out of existence. And then from that point on, when I was walking, I was in this exquisite state of connectedness. Like every bird, every sound, I was guided, just like when I was 9, 10, 11 years old, but in a beautifully connected state. And I get up to the top of the ridge and I look over, and there's the Wallace Stegner bench, named after a famous poet at Stanford. And I go over to that bench and I start sitting down, and then my body is shifted to the right. Boom. Okay, I'm sitting on the right side of the bench because I'm tied into being guided. And about 3 minutes later, up behind me bustles 3 older people, two ladies and a man. They bustle on over, and because they see that I'm on the right side of the bench, they feel drawn to the bench. And they say, "Oh, can we sit here?" And I said, "Well, sure, and can we eat our lunch?" And sure, you can eat your lunch. And so they're eating their lunch, and somehow we got around to talking about ourselves. And it turns out he's a professor somewhere. I kind of got that, and it was his wife and her best friend, and just wonderful people, probably in their late 60s. The kind of people you just love to hang out with. And I told them about what I was working on and the origin of life at UC Santa Cruz, and we just had some major publications and everything. And then I remembered that 2 weeks before, I'd been in front of a group of postdocs at a big conference, and I had said to them, guys, this work, there's at least a half a dozen Nobel Prizes in this work, if you take it up. If you work on this diligently, and that to get their attention, like, oh, there's a half dozen Nobel Prizes coming through this work. And I would love to be the fuddy-duddy, gray-haired funny old guy in the back of the room in, Stockholm, while you are getting those Nobel Prizes, or at least one of you. I'd love to be present with and to witness that. And I just described these to these three wonderful people. And the man looked up and he said, "That's what I'm doing next week." I said, "Really?" "Yes, I'm flying to Stockholm. I'm the fuddy-duddy guy in the back of the room in the tuxedo. Everyone has to wear a tuxedo. Everyone looks like a penguin. And their tuxedos provided by the Nobel organization, fitted to you in your hotel room. And my student is getting the Nobel Prize. It's the second time this has happened. This is the second student. And he's in his mid-50s or early 50s, and it's in economics. It was the second time. And it was like, whoa. And I left them. I became friends with them. I go to their Christmas party every year now. But I was walking back down the mountain, and I turned back to the field, this great thing. I said, "You rock." That was such a powerful that was such a powerful demo of your capability.
Yeah.
When you think about that, I have this thought about doing this. I have this connection. They're lined up, right? What is the probability? The probability is virtually zero for this to happen, right? And yet it happens, and there's this perfect intersection, and this idea comes, and he's the only person in the United States that is their very next week going to do the thing that I had the vision for 2 weeks before, and I meet them. And that's the field. That is its power. It's delivery power, it's predictive power, it's reliable power. So, it's just it's like me trying to give the thing back to the little boy. It's just the same stuff, but it's vastly accelerated since 1971 or whatever it was. It's vastly more densely connected now. So the field is rocking it.
So if you're looking at the history of the known physical universe, what I'm hearing you say is that synchronicities have been increasing since the beginning, and they're really reaching an intense peak right now, which provides, one would have to say, magical opportunities for people who are aware of what's going on.
Yeah, and so the engineer in me, a couple of years ago, asked the question, how can we formalize this and use this as a tool? And what is going on? Terence, back in the day, Terence McKenna used to say, "What is going on?" For him, a lot was going on, much of the time. So I came up with this model that if you put intention out, so that, remember how we were talking about how the stacking of the sun rising every morning and going through this engine that stacks evolution and probability, and we're at this huge probability potential gradient. We're sitting on the top of that gradient. And that gradient is a potential field. It is the field. It is the synchronous field. But it's not only it's a wafting of probabilities, so that you're in a space where extremely improbable events are happening all the time. And then there's a network effect. There's a network effect, and there's a gigantic memory system. And if that isn't the definition of a powerful synchronous field, I don't know what is. It's just so large that we can't write formulas for it and say, well, it starts here and it ends there, and it has this shape and color and everything. No, we are it. We're in it. And so it's really high. It's way up here. And so then I said, how does the mechanism work? And for the SAND conference a couple of years ago, in my SAND 2017 talk, I proposed it from that vision of how we were made. I think that I might have said that in the previous show. There is another mechanism that if you project a vision, a strongly held dream or vision, you use your imagination to view beautiful outcomes, like I'm going to make this fantastic quilt, or learn to be a dancer, or do such and such, or it actually shapes future probability just in front of you. So your attention that's held beautifully and closely without sort of nervousness and shakiness, it's held very clearly, clear-eyed intention, shapes probability so that events that lead to the outcome start rolling like marbles down into a valley in front of you. And when one rolls down, your intention has created the attention on the probabilistic field, and it creates an action. And the marble is there, and if you pick up the marble, like playing Doom or Duke Nukem or something, and put it in your pocket, or do the action that the marble, and trust in that, then the probability is shaped ahead of that, and shaped ahead of that. And sometimes there's branch points. But you pick up these marbles, and it shapes and shapes and shapes and shapes and shapes and shapes until you reach this stupendous outcome. And so for the SAND talk, which we can put in the feed, for me it led to going from seeing the vision of the moving marbles, the molecules in the air, all the way to the origin of life hypothesis, and then the testing and meeting Dave. And the example, here's an example. So I moved to Boulder Creek, Santa Cruz Mountains in 1994. In 1998, I buy this farm. It has a huge barn. Huge barn. Like, why did I buy a farm with a huge barn? I suddenly get obsessed with collecting vintage computer hardware. And I'd been interested in Xerox PARC because I'd written some of the first graphical interface software in the 80s for PCs based on Xerox and Xerox PARC with their help. And so I get obsessed. And by 2000, 2001, the barn is getting filled with vintage computers. And it's just craziness. I'm building the hugest website to tell the whole history of computing. This isn't part of my path, is it? But no, I'm obsessed. I've been given this mission, and I love it. And I held the opening in 2013 with Galen. She and I put together the opening, and 300 people showed up. And we had, by that time, just in 2 years, I had a Cray supercomputer. I had Xerox networks working. I had Altairs and a fantastic collection just poured in. Computer museum in the barn.
Were they operational?
A lot could be. You couldn't operate. Some of them were just dead as doornails, but people showed up to fix them. It was like a huge synchronous thing. But that wasn't the end of it. So that was the best possible outcome for creating a computer museum. I mean, William Shatner shot for 4 days and beamed me into the Cray for a show called How William Shatner Changed the World. It was on History Channel and Discovery Channel. People seen it. It's all about Star Trek and how it predicted the future that then came. But the key thing was in 2009 when Dave Deamer, who had moved into the Santa Cruz Mountains at precisely the same year that I had, saw an article in the paper about a crazy guy that had a Cray supercomputer in his barn somewhere in the Santa Cruz Mountains. And he happened to ask another professor in the Department of Chemistry about this. And she said, "We know that guy. Would you like to come to dinner?" And I went to dinner, and I met Dave. And it was the most brilliant partnership. This meeting, that moment meeting Dave, was opened the door to this Origin of Life work and insight.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
by following the marble of crazy, like lost my marbles collecting these vintage computers, it led to that one little thing that was going to connect me with David Deamer that led to this miraculous final stretch of the outcome. And so it's all those doggone marbles, you know.
What a wonderful story. I'm impressed. Of course, I met Dave Deamer long before that. I met him back in the late 1970s, as I recall. But he's the perfect guy for you.
Yeah, an inquiring mind, you know, and was it the consciousness research group in Berkeley or something that you guys were both in?
We used to hobnob around with several groups, and he was if I remember rightly, at UC Davis then in teaching biology, and then he moved to Santa Cruz, and I visited him there as well. He was really, ever since I've known him, a wonderful man and very helpful to me starting out as a graduate student in parapsychology. He was just a great friend.
He's a complete gentleman, and so the fortune that I have is there are very few gentlemen scientists or gentlewomen scientists left because they can't be. I mean, the system doesn't reward that. And so here's this man who's not retired, but is a research professor, but very highly regarded in the field. And he would spend the time with me, 6 years of having tea in his house twice a month so that he could educate me on the whole field, the politics, and give me papers to read and the chemistry and everything so that I could fashion my sort of visionary systems approach with his solid chemistry, 50 years of work into a single hypothesis that we developed together. In fact, we just published 2 weeks ago an review article on Dave's history, and I did the questions, and he had these beautiful answers illustrated in a special edition of the journal Life, commemorating his 80th birthday, which was just back on the 21st of April. And there's all these other articles now coming into this commemorative issue. And I can send that to the listeners too, so they can learn about Dave.
Yes, we'll put all of that in the comments section under this video, and maybe Dave would be willing to be interviewed as well. I'd love to have him on the channel.
I'm sure he would. Yeah, I'm sure he'd be delighted to come back. Yeah.
Yeah. That's really a nice connection that you've had. And I have to say, Bruce, you've really opened up tonight. I have seen a whole different side of you that I wasn't quite aware of before. It's wonderful. You have a big heart.
Thank you. Thank you, Jeff. It's, well, you do too. And the fact that you have listened to so many people over the years and internalized their systems, the systems of the world. And in fact, I was just watching Bernardo Kastrup's talk with you, and he's an amazing being too. I've had the honor of being on a couple of podcasts with him and in conversation with him, and such a beautifully motivated and passionate person in his exploring his own realms.
Well, this has been a delightful conversation. It makes me just look forward all the more to the future, because I have a feeling, Bruce, that you and I can take these conversations into new territory for both of us that would be, I think, not only fascinating for us, but for the viewers as well.
And perhaps in a subsequent conversation, I can talk a little bit more about what could be some of the front edge of the healing arts and the awakening arts, if you call them, that I'm now sort of training in, and all the parts, the little wounded parts and the systems that operate people, and learning how to scan those and to highly empathize with those, and how to allow those to heal themselves, just as what happened to me on last Sunday, and the beauty of that, and this is what was explained to us, and I'll finish with this. Annalisa was explaining to us that if we can go there, if we can go to self, Dharmakaya, if that's what, I may have the term wrong, but where it's you in relationship to your parts, in relationship to this huge synchronous field that is guiding, in relationship to being open to total energy and self-reorganization. You don't need a practitioner with you. You don't need a teacher. So in one level, it takes the workload down, and it allows beings that are coming into the program to actually do their work rapidly and come into this clarity and healing and super rapidly. And I think if it removes whole levels from the healing arts and the I don't know what you call all this feel, all this striving, all this techniques and methods and things like this, removes that, because it's a self-to-self practice. And you can resource your own system this way, but you can also connect this way with this huge thing. And perhaps it's an accelerator. So if people can learn that doorway in, then we can roll through society. Millions, billions of people potentially could roll into these states, these transformed states. And I think it's what the Tibetan Buddhists have been calling for. We need 10,000 Buddhists, but maybe we could just start with 2 or 3, or even just 1,
The practice of Dharmakaya.
Yeah, if I got it right, I better look this up on Wikipedia. But
because I think when you were describing your experience last Sunday, and hopefully maybe in the future we can just talk about that in some depth, I was thinking, you know what, I'm going to title this program Universal Love. That's what it's about.
It really is. And I certainly, Jeffrey, I see that in your face every time I see you. I see universal love there.
That's why I was named Mishlove.
You were named Mishlove.
Yeah.
Is that your given name, or is that a name that...
No, it's a family name. Yeah.
Wow. And what meaning does it have in the...
One day, I was thinking about my name, Jeffrey Mishlove, and I began chanting to myself a mantra, and I took the name Jeffrey, and I thought, well, that's like Godfrey, Mishlove, my love, God free my love. And I was chanting this mantra as I was walking down, I think it was 25th Avenue in San Francisco, where I lived at the time. And as I was chanting the mantra, a car goes by, and it's my friend Ray Stubbs waving out the window at me. Ray Stubbs was a teacher of tantric mysticism, now that I think about it.
It's the synchronous field again.
Yeah,
that wonderful field that God free Mishlove, my love.
Yeah. Something like that. Yeah, I had translated my name into the mantra, God free my love.
Oh. Yeah. Oh, beautiful.
Yeah. Well, Bruce, I'm so high talking to you. I can tell this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
It is. It truly is. And let's continue, and we can get geeky again.
Thank you once again from the bottom of my heart. This has just been a magnificent time with you.
Blessings. Thank you.